Welcome to video 7. In the last video we polished the fingerboard. In this video we're going to fill the grain on the body, and we're going to work on the neck and fingerboard, and we will take the neck all the way through carving and through fretting, and we will have polished frets at the end of this video. The next phase I want to sand and fill the grain on this rosewood before I glue the binding on. I don't want to take a chance on the filler staining the binding. I'll be careful on the top, but I haven't sanded the top yet. One thing I do have is my bandsaw. I had an accident. When I was cutting it out, the bandsaw table was not quite 90 degrees. So I've got to try to fix these scratches from the bandsaw, but that shouldn't be too bad. So I'm going to start with probably 80 grit to get some of those saw marks out and work my way up to 220, and then maybe 180 I'll grain fill, and then Alright, so I'm going to mix up my filler. I'm using this filler. It's a rosewood color. Alright, we'll see how this works. This is a little thinner than I usually make it. Put some on. I'm going to take a spreader. I'm going to spread it, force it into the grain with the grain, and then I will take the spreader and run it diagonally to the grain, and that will pull any extra out. Now I'll move to the sides and repeat. Alright, I have let the grain filler dry, and you can see this is where I've sanded it off to 180. This is where it was. So I'm just going to sand this with 180. I'm going to leave it. I'm going to glue the binding on next, and then once that's done we'll get it sanded back again through 180 and 220, and then we'll be pretty much done with the body. Just when we install hardware, we've got to drill a hole for the jack for the electronics, and we've got to sand the top. And soon. We're moving on to attaching the fingerboard to the neck, and what I do is I take a couple of staples, drive them in at opposite points along the neck, and then I bend up one side and clip it off just above the wood. And what this does, it gives me a little point that when I set the fingerboard in place and press down, it leaves 2 marks, and then when I put the glue on, I can take the marks, set them right in place, and the fingerboard doesn't slip when I apply clamping pressure. If you've ever clamped pieces of wood together, you know that the glue makes it a little slick before it actually holds, and that is what those pins do. They keep the fingerboard in place. So I'm using old brown glue, which is a easily reversed glue. You'll see me switch back and forth between Titebond and the old brown glue, and I usually use the old brown glue on any joint that may need to be reversed someday. The Titebond I tend to use where really it shouldn't have to be reversed. So you want to be careful not to get any glue on the truss rod. Usually on a guitar I'll put a piece of tape, but this fingerboard is very narrow, so I was just very careful not to get any into the truss rod. And now I'm using some wax paper and my 16-inch radius caul, and I'll apply clamps, and the fingerboard will be glued in place, and it's just going to dry overnight so we can move forward with more neck work. Ready to begin carving the neck. So I've set the neck up in my vise, and I will use different types of rasps and files to give it a nice curve. I'll probably put some guidelines in so that I round it evenly. But other than that, I'm ready to go. So what I did is I pre-carved the neck. I didn't finish the final carve. I just wanted to get a basic shape. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to glue on the head plate, and from there we'll be able to shape the headstock and get the final shape of the neck as it blends into the headstock. So I've lined up, I've cut away some of the extra material on the head plate. I'm using the nut material as a guide for how far to glue the head plate down, because then my nut will just slide right into that gap when I get it made. So I've taken the neck and I've drilled some holes for the side dots, and I'm installing these abalone dots, which are very, very tiny. So what I'm doing is I'm taking them one at a time, dipping them in a little bit of thick super glue, and then inserting them into the holes. Next thing I need to do is to drill the tuner holes. So I've lined up a guide, 1/4-inch holes for these particular tuners with the standard mandolin spacing. I'm going to drill a 1/4-inch hole straight through, and I have a backer board to reduce the tear on. I'm probably only going to be able to get these middle two holes, but then I've got some pins that I'll put in to keep the alignment. There we go. Tuners come through perfectly fine. And what we're going to do is we're going to ream out the top end of that hole for the bushing. We may also thin this headstock a little bit so these tuners poke out a little bit more. We'll do that from the back. Now we just got to drill the other side. So we need to ream out part of the hole for the cap. So I've marked about 1/4 of an inch down, a little less than 1/4 of an inch, which is the depth of the inserts. And we'll just ream all of these out. Alright, now that the tuners are all drilled out, I have to cut out the access for the truss rod. So I'm going to use my Dremel with a carving bit. Alright, we'll just do a little more cleanup and we'll have some nice access for that. So what I've done now is I've made up a fingerboard extension that will slip over the dovetail, lock in place, and it's set at the slight angle that I need over the body once I glue the neck in. So I'll glue this in place and then I'll be ready to final sand and fret the neck. Alright, we've finished sanding, got the fingerboard repolished, cleaned up some of the dust that got onto the maple. Now we're going to install some frets, maybe all the frets. So what I do is I've got a bound fretboard, so I have to use this tool, which will nip the ends of the tang so that it can fit over the binding. So I'm going to cut. Some people cut them out all at once. I like to work one at a time. So I'm going to measure a fret with a little bit of overhang. And then I'm going to kind of eyeball where I have to nip those tangs off. and tap it in with my fretting hammer. All the frets are hammered in. I'm going to take a fretboard edge file and we're going to bevel the edges of the frets. Easy to do on a guitar neck. What we'll do is we'll run this file along until we get a nice bevel, then we'll do the other side, and then we'll be ready to level, crown, and polish the frets. Okay, the ends of the frets are all nicely beveled. Now we've just got to do the leveling and then recrowning. I've taped off the fingerboard in preparation for leveling the frets, and then I've taken a black Sharpie and drawn a line at the top of each fret. We're going to take this sanding beam, which is perfectly straight beam. I've put 320 grit sticky sandpaper on it, and I'm going to run the beam across the frets. And what we're doing is we're knocking off the high spots, and you'll see as you go along the marker starts to disappear. And when the marker has disappeared across the tops of all the frets, they should be level. We will go in at a later point and check the frets with a rocker, but this method works really well for getting the frets nice and level. Now that we have the frets leveled, we need to reproduce the crown because we've flattened quite a few of the frets in the leveling process. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my Sharpie again, and I am putting a line across the top of the frets, and we're going to take a crowning file, and what that does is it will re-establish the shape of the fret. And what we're looking for is to actually leave just a thin line of the magic marker on top of the fret. That's the point at which the string will touch the fret, and it's important for good intonation and playability all the way down the neck. So I've got this file which actually is shaped like the crown of the fret, and a few passes with that and we get the round shape back. Works really well. Now that we've restored the crowns, what we're going to do is we're going to take an end file and we're going to clean up the ends of the frets. Even though we've beveled them nicely and we've restored the crown, those edges of the frets still can be fairly sharp. So I'm going to go through with this file. It does a really nice job of taking off those little burrs that are left behind from all the process and giving you a nice smooth edge so you don't cut your fingers while you're playing. This will take a while. You run your finger over it, and then actually after we remove the tape, I may have to do some more touch-up because the tape does keep the file from getting all the way down. Now that we've got the edges smoothed out, what we're going to do is we're going to polish the frets. And what I'm using is fret rubbers from Crimson Guitars. They work really well. I'm starting with coarse, and what the coarse will do is it'll take off any remaining tool marks, and then we'll move up through the medium, fine, and super fine, and that will give the frets a really nice polish. At this point, I'm also going to make sure that with all this crowning and polishing, but with the coarse, that I haven't changed the height of the fret. So I'm using this tool to check to see if there are any high or low spots on the fretboard. And there were none when I checked, so feel pretty good, and we'll continue with our polishing. We're finishing up now with the super fine fret rubber. We'll move on after that to some polishing compound, and then we will remove the tape and have a fingerboard ready, and the neck is now ready to be installed in the body. It's September 7th. October 1st deadline is looming. I fell way behind on this project due to other commitments, but I think that going forward, all I have left to do is finish binding, which the final binding strips arrived in the mail today, and I should be able to get this bound and the neck glued in by the weekend, and then it's just a case of final sanding and polishing and building a bridge and the nut. So I think we'll make the deadline. We're going to French polish it instead of my original thought of nitrocellulose lacquer, because I just don't have the time for that. But I think French polishing will look good. Thanks for watching.